Thank you for being here this evening. While we can't be together in person, this would be the first community read where this hasn't been, sort of a crazy month of lots of in-person events in various formats. It's honestly very heartwarming to see so many turn out on such a beautiful night for such a reflective author reading and talk. We're hoping for a lot of interesting discussion towards the end. My name is Lauren Fender. I'm the coordinator of reference and public services at the Belmont Public Library. And I'm co-chair of the Better Through Books Healing Community Together Committee, better known to most as One Book, One Belmont. I'm delighted to introduce to you this evening Dr. Jerald Walker, professor of creative writing at Emerson College and author of tonight's book of discussion, How to Make a Slave and Other Essays. Before I introduce Dr. Walker more fully, I would just like to thank the Friends of the Belmont Public Library who helped make all of Better Through Books programs possible, as well as the rest of the library's programs throughout the year, day in and day out. I would also like to thank the many co-sponsors of One Book, One Belmont, including Belmont Against Racism, Belmont Books, Belmont Chinese American Association, Belmont Council on Aging, Belmont Food Collaborative, the Belmont Gallery of Art, Belmont Human Rights Commission, Belmont Public Schools, Belmont Religious Council, the Belmont Wellness Coalition, the Belmont Women's Club, and of course, the Board of Library Trustees. Without all of these individuals and groups, we wouldn't be able to have such a robust programming for this and generally throughout the year when we work collaboratively on other things. So now I'm just going to give a short introduction to Dr. Walker or Jerald Walker. Jerald Walker is the author of The World in Flames, A Black Boyhood in a White Supremacist Doomsday Cult, and Street Shadows, A Memory of Race, Rebellion, and Redemption, winner of the 2011 Penn New England Award for Nonfiction. He has published in magazines such as Creative Nonfiction, Harvard Review, Missouri Review, River Teeth, Mother Jones, Iowa Review, and Oxford American, and has been widely anthologized, including 5 times in the Best American Essays, of which I am a huge fan personally. The recipient of the James A. Michener and National Endowment of the Arts Fellowships, Jerald Walker is a professor of creative writing at Emerson College. And with that, I will say thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I'm happy to be here. Thank you also to all of your sponsors. That's quite a backing you have for your events. That's impressive. What we thought we would do was I would read 2 pieces lasting maybe 25 minutes or so, and then open it up for questions, whatever you want to talk about. The pieces in the book, craft, writing, the weather, you name it, I'm happy to talk about it. The first piece is called Dragon Slayers. I was at a Christmas party with a man who wanted me to hate him. I should hate all whites, he felt, for what they have done to me. I thought hard about what whites have done to me. I was 40, old enough to have accumulated a few unpleasant racial encounters, but nothing of any lasting significance came to mind. The man was astonished at this response. How about slavery, he asked. I explained, as politely as I could, that I had not been a slave. But you feel its effects, he snapped. Racism, discrimination, and prejudice will always be a problem for you in this country. White people, he insisted, are your oppressors. I glanced around the room just as one of my oppressors happened by. She was holding a tray of canapés. She offered me one. I asked the man if, as a form of reparations, I should take 2. Thank you for the laugh. I appreciate it. It was midway through my 3rd year in academia. I had survived mountains of papers, apathetic students, cantankerous colleagues, boring meetings, sleep deprivation, and 2 stalkers. And now I was up against a man who had been mysteriously transported from 1962. He even looked the part with lavish sideburns and solid black-rimmed glasses. He wasn't an academic, but rather the spouse of one. In fact, he had no job at all, a dual act of defiance, he felt, against a patriarchal and capitalistic society. He was a fun person to talk with, especially like me, you enjoyed driving white liberals up the wall. And the surest way to do that, if you were Black, was to deny them the chance to pity you. He'd spotted me 30 minutes earlier while I stood alone at the dining room table, grazing on various appetizers. My wife, Brenda, had drifted off somewhere, and the room buzzed with pockets of conversation and laughter. The man joined me. I accepted his offer of a gin and tonic. We talked local politics for a moment, or rather he talked and I listened because, being relatively new to this small town, it wasn't something I knew much about. Before moving on to the Patriots, our kids, and finally my classes. He was particularly interested in my African American literature course. "Do you have any Black students?" he inquired. "Well, we started with 2, I said, but ended with 28. I let his puzzled expression linger until I'd eaten a stuffed mushroom. "Everyone who takes the course has to agree to be Black for the duration of the semester." "Really?" he asked, laughing. "What do they do, smear their faces with burnt cork?" "Not a bad idea," I said. "But for now, they simply have to think like Blacks, but in a way different from what they probably expect." I told him that Black literature is often approached as records of oppression, but that my students don't focus on white cruelty, but rather its flip side, Black courage. "After all," I continued, "slaves and their immediate descendants were by and large heroic, not pathetic, or I wouldn't be standing here." The man was outraged. "You're letting whites off the hook," he said. "You're absolving them of responsibility, of the obligation to atone for past and present wrongs." He went on in this vein for a good while, and I am pleased to say that I goaded him until he stormed across the room and stood with his wife, who, after he'd spoken with her, glanced in my direction to see, no doubt, a traitor to the Black race. That was unfortunate. I'd like to think I betray whites too. More precisely, it's the belief that Blacks are primarily victims that I betray, a common view held by both races. I too held it for many years. When I was in my early 20s and making my first crude attempts at writing fiction, I'd sit at my word processor and pound out stories brimming with Blacks who understood only anger and pain. My settings were always ghettos because that was what I knew, and the plots centered on hardship and suffering because I knew that too. And I also knew this: white society was responsible for the existence of this miserable world, and it was my duty as a Black artist to make this clear. 3 of these stories gained me acceptance into the Ira Writers Workshop. It was there that my awakening occurred. My first course was with Frank Conroy, the program's director. He was brutally honest and harbored a militant obsession with clarity. Most of the 2-hour-long classes were spent with him shredding the stories in our egos. We squirmed in our seats and wiped our brows as he did his infamous line by line, zeroing in on words and phrases that confused the work's meaning or failed to make unequivocal sense. It was the most intense and best writing class that I'd ever had. I went into the second semester confident that my prose had improved and that the most difficult course was behind me. Randomly, I decided to take a workshop with James Allen McPherson. During the break before classes resumed, I read for the first time his books, Hue and Cry and Elbow Room. The impact his writing had on me was profound. He too chronicled the lives of African Americans, and he had done it in short story form, my genre of choice at the time. This was the motto I'd been searching for. I read the stories over and over again, convinced that I had found my literary father. The contrast between Conroy and McPherson could not have been more stark. Conroy was tall, white, and boisterous. McPherson was short, Black, and shy. Conroy cursed, yelled, and laughed and joked. McPherson rarely spoke at all, and when he did, his voice was so quiet you often couldn't hear him. The students dominated his workshop. I was disappointed. McPherson was a Pulitzer Prize winner, after all, the first African-American to receive that honor for fiction. He was the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant, as well as countless other awards. I wanted his insight. I wanted his wisdom. He gave it mid-semester when it was time to workshop my first story. Before we begin today, he said, I'd like to make a few comments. This was new. He'd never prefaced a story before. A smile crept on my face as I allowed myself to imagine him praising me for my depiction of a den of heroin addicts, for this was not easy to do, requiring, among other things, an intimate knowledge of heroin addicts and a certain flair for profanity. Are you all familiar with gangster rap? McPherson asked. We were, despite the fact that besides me, all of the students were white and mostly middle to upper class. While we each nodded our familiarity with the genre, McPherson reached into a shopping bag he brought and removed a magazine. He opened it to a pre-marked page on which was a picture of a rapper, cloaked in jewelry and guns and leaning against the hood of a squad car. Behind him was a sprawling slum. This person raps about the ghetto, McPherson said, but he doesn't live in the ghetto. He lives in a white, wealthy suburb with his wife and daughter. His daughter attends a predominantly white private school. That's what this article is about. He closed the magazine and returned it to the bag. What some gangster rappers are doing, he continued, is using Black stereotypes because white people eat that stuff up. But these images are false. They're dishonest. Some rappers are selling out their race for personal gain. He paused again, this time to hold up my story. That's what this writer is doing with his work. He set my story back on the table. Okay, that's all I have to say. You can discuss it now. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was of my labored breathing. And then someone said, McPherson's right. The story is garbage. Complete rubbish, said another. And so it went from there. I did not sleep that night. At 8 a.m., when I could hold out no longer, I called McPherson at home and demanded a conference. He agreed to meet me in his office in 10 minutes. He was there when I arrived, sitting behind his desk. The desk was bare except for a copy of my story, and the office was bare except for the desk and 2 chairs. The built-in bookshelves held nothing, and nothing hung on the walls. There was no dressing on the window, no telephone, and no computer. It might have been the janitor's office, a place to catch a few winks while the mop floors dried. And McPherson might have been the janitor. His blue shirt was a mass of wrinkles, and his eyes were bloodshot. His trademark hat, a beige straw tangle, seemed to rest at an odd angle on his head. From beneath it, a single long braid had worked its way free and dangled rebelliously behind his right ear. He noticed me staring at it and poked it back into concealment. Are you okay? He asked. His voice was gentle, full of concern. You sounded like a crazy man on the phone. Well, I'm not a crazy man, I said. I reached forward to tap my finger on my story and proceeded to rant and rave as only a crazy man could. I did not make this stuff up, I insisted. I'm from the ghetto. I went through the characters one by one, citing various relatives on whom they were based, and I mentioned that just the week before, my younger brother had been shot in the back while in McDonald's. I told him I had another brother who was in and out of prison, a heroin addict sister-in-law, that I had once been arrested for car theft, falsely, but that's besides the point, and that many of my friends were still living in the miserable community in which I had been raised. You misread my story, I said in conclusion, and you misread me. I leaned back and folded my arms across my chest, waiting for his apology. Instead, I watched as he sprang from his chair and hurried from the room. He turned left into the hall, and a moment later he passed going right, with Frank Conroy calling after him, and then they pass left again, this time with Connie Brothers, the program's administrator, in tow. And after two more passes, this awful parade came to an end somewhere out of view. Now Connie stood before me, looking as nauseous as I felt. Jim is the kindest soul on earth, she said quietly. Why? Why would you insult him? For an instant, I saw myself at 12, looking at a closed front door, behind which was my first love, who had just dumped me and left me standing on her porch, trying unsuccessfully not to cry. Connie magically produced a tissue and handed it to me. She rubbed my shoulders while I rambled incoherently, something about sleep deprivation and McPherson being my father. It's okay, sweetie, Connie said. I'll talk to him. McPherson returned momentarily. I apologized. He told me it was okay, that workshops can make people uptight and sensitive. It had been difficult for him too, he explained, when he was a student there in the 70s. There was a lull in the conversation before he asked, so, where are your people from? He still does not believe me, I thought. Chicago. No, that's where they are. Where are they from? Oh, sorry, Arkansas. Mine are from Georgia, he said. He smiled and added, that place is a motherfucker. The essence of Black America was conveyed in that response, a toughness of spirit, humor laced with tragedy. But at that moment, all I saw was the man who had rejected my vision. Defeated, I thanked him for agreeing to meet with me, as I rose to leave. He stood and shook my hand. As I was walking out the door, he called my name. I turned to face him. Stereotypes are valuable, he said, but only if you use them to your advantage. They present your readers with something they'll recognize, and it pulls them into what appears to be familiar territory, a comfort zone. But once they're in, you have to show them. But once they're in, you have to move them beyond the stereotype. You have to show them what's real. What's real? I asked. Without hesitation, he said, you. It was one of those things that you instantly recognize as profound, and then, because you do not quite understand it, try to forget as quickly as you can. It was also one of those things that you cannot forget. And so it roamed freely in my subconscious, occasionally coming into sharp focus to remind me of its presence. But I allowed myself to be consumed by it no more than I would a housefly for about a year. And then I went to see him again. I was wondering, I said, if you wouldn't mind supervising an independent project. That depends, he responded, on what you'd like to study. Me, I said. I want to study me. We started with Black folklore and history. Next, we moved on to jazz and blues, and then we covered a broad range of Black literature and culture. We studied Black intellectuals and philosophers, sociologists, anthropologists, activists, filmmakers, and ex-cons. For 4 years, we dissected nearly every aspect of Black life and thought, and in the process, a theme emerged that had been there all along. Life is a motherfucker, living it anyway, and sometimes laughing in the process is where humanity is won. And this is what I learned about me. I had become my own stereotype, a character in one of my short stories who insisted on seeing himself primarily as a repository of pain and defeat, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The very people with whom I had been raised and dedicated myself to rendering in prose had become victims of my myopia. My story showed people suffering from drug addiction, racism, poverty, murder, crime, violence, but they said nothing about the spirit that, despite being confronted with what often amounted to certain defeat, would continue to struggle and aspire for something better. That old slave song, "We Shall Overcome," pretty much says it all. The coursework I conducted with McPherson ultimately contributed to a doctorate in interdisciplinary studies. McPherson served as my dissertation chair. I knew when I started my academic career that I owed him a debt to teach Black literature in a certain way. Less time needs to be spent on the dragons, he told me once, and more on our ability to forge swords for battle and the skill with which we've used them. The man at the Christmas party, of course, would rather that I talk about the dragons. And at first, when students take my class, they are surprised, even a bit disappointed, to see that the course will not head in that direction. But by the end of the semester, they are invariably uplifted by the heroic nature of African Americans, in part, perhaps, because it is the nature found in us all. Sometimes students thank me for this approach. On occasion, they ask me where I got the idea. I tell them I got it from my father. That piece about James Allen McPherson is meaningful to me in many ways because he is the person who I credit with helping me rethink the way I write, rethink the way I think, and even rethink the way I live. And if you have a chance to check the book out of the Belmont Public Library, or if you want to splurge and buy a copy, which is fine by me, you will see that the dedication page is to James Allen McPherson, because he meant that much to me. Unfortunately, he passed away just a couple of years ago. The next piece I'll read, a little short piece, and then we can chat. It's called Thieves. Whole Foods shoppers are easy targets, so busy choosing their imported wheat germ and organic kiwi that they forget about thieves. They are also wealthy, at least the ones who live in this town on the shore, where the median home value is $1 million and the cars are typically high-end, like the Mercedes I parked my Toyota next to. I am a good 60 yards away from the store's entrance, far enough to complicate a getaway, I note, though by no means making it impossible. Security is light, and the odds of a passerby confronting a running Black man are slim. I prefer coming here mid-morning on a weekday when it's not very crowded, and that will be especially true now since it's been drizzling for the last hour. Once I am inside, the weather works further in my favor, allowing me to spend several seconds wiping my feet while surveying carts for unattended purses. Right off, I see two directly in my path near the apricots. A few feet beyond those, there is another by the corn on the cob. The purse's owners are steps away, their backs to me as they make their overpriced selections. I could have the purses and be gone in a flash. Instead, I remain by the door holding my grocery list close to my face, studying it intensely, offering the possibility that I am a near dutiful spouse, struggling to decipher his wife's scribble. The corn gatherer isn't falling for it. We've made eye contact, and now she returns to her cart, deposits her corn, and then lifts her purse and slips it over her shoulder. The apricot pickers haven't noticed me. I pry a shopping basket from the stack. Against my better judgment, I hurry forward, triggering what I sometimes imagine is an ultrasonic alarm. The two women I am approaching dart glances over their shoulders, seeing me before I have a chance to reach them, and move to secure their belongings. Another woman, elderly, slightly stooped, light reflecting off the gems squeezing her pudgy fingers, appears at my side, talking about arugula. You used to keep it by the broccoli, she is saying. It was there just last week. Pardon me? The arugula, where did you move it? I don't work here, I say. She looks confused. He can probably help you. I point to a man watering daisies. Like all the store employees, he is wearing a brown apron with Whole Foods printed in large letters on the front. I am wearing a blazer, shirt, tie, and stone-washed jeans, a style, according to one of my graduate students, known as smart casual. A prideful part of me wants to mention this to the elderly woman, emphasizing that I am a college professor, but I say nothing as she goes to the produce clerk, who leads her to a field of greens with labels identifying the various species. Perhaps I only look casual, and a bushel of arugula will complete the ensemble. The thought occurs to me in jest, but nonetheless I act on it. Next, I get some zucchini, scallions, beets, oranges, and bananas, checking each item off my list while working my way to the seafood. There, a man behind the counter, who at most is 20 years old, exactly 31 years my junior, nods at me and says, "What's up?" I reposition the arugula, moving it higher for him to see. Then I bend toward the glass encasement, mainly so he can get a good view of the gray in my hair, that at least with my undergraduates seems to discourage familiarity. But it does not have this effect on the fishmonger. "Thanks, bro," he says, after filling my request for a pound of Atlantic salmon. I check my list again. One more item, bread, located on the opposite end of the store. This time I use my phone as a prop, thumbing through emails while being mindful of more purses. I make it past 4 without tripping the ultrasonic alarm, picking up a bottle of rosemary-infused olive oil in the process. And now I am at the bakery, trying to decide between the pumpkin blue cheese biscuits and the brioche. This time, my own ultrasonic alarm sounds, causing me to glance to my right where, inches from my elbow, is an abandoned cart with a purse unzipped, the wallet inside half exposed like a treasure chest in sand. They belong, I presume, to the blonde woman 5 feet away, nibbling at a display of breadsticks and hummus. Before she turns to see what a foolish mistake she's made, I scoop up a brioche and head for the nearest register. I am third in line. 2 customers ahead of me, I realize, is the corn gatherer. She is loading her food onto the conveyor belt, her purse still dangling from her shoulder, her thoughts, I suspect, a million miles from our encounter. Or maybe it never registered at all. Maybe her reaction to me was pure instinct, her body propelled into motion before her mind gave consent. Later, when I am trying to forgive her, this is what I'll conclude. Outside, the drizzle has become a steady rain. Several customers wait for it to abate while standing in the vestibule. I consider doing the same, but I am agitated, as coming to Whole Foods always makes me, and all I want is to be at home. I step through the doors and take off for my car, walking quickly at first, and then, just as I'd imagined, breaking into a run. There you have it.
Great.
Thank you, Jerald, so much. Dragon Slayers was probably personally one of my favorite essays. It was really interesting hearing about your experience at Iowa Writers Workshop, but then especially about your relationship and building that relationship with James. So I thought that was or McPherson, I should say. I'm not sure if he would prefer me to use his first name or not. So I just love that you, and one of my questions actually is related to that. But with all of that in mind, we don't have to start with anything that I had in terms of questions. Does anybody have any thoughts that they want to share, questions either about the writing or content or Jerald's experiences throughout his life, of many of which are covered in various essays in this collection?
I have several.
Go for it, Catherine.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you for these are brilliant. I'm particularly drawn to Dragon Slayers because for 2 reasons. One is I find it so universal. you're hearing young people talk about authentic self these days. It's a term that you hear, I'm sure you hear from your students. And so, but we all, you know, I think the role for all of us is to get beyond stereotypes and find the real self of people. So thank you for that. I wonder two things: what you do with your own students. Are you there, Mcpherson? And if so, how do you approach that? And the other question is, I'm an Iowa gal, so I grew up in the time when Paul Ingalls was head. So, and we always thought it was quite amazing. I was from a small town that people would actually come to Iowa to learn to write. So I wondered if you could just reflect a little bit on your experiences there. Thank you.
I'll start with, thank you, Catherine. I'll start with Iowa first. If I could move back to Iowa City tomorrow, I would do it. I think people who have not lived there or spent time there do not realize what a phenomenal little city it is. It is as friendly as any place you'll ever go. Almost everyone has some relationship to the university. Almost everyone graduated from the writer's workshop, it seems. I mean, your next door neighbor, the male one, everybody's a writer, and it's a wonderful, wonderful community. As far as me being Jim McPherson to my students, that would be fantastic if I could live up to his excellence. I think that would be the greatest tribute I could give that man. I certainly try to be as thoughtful and as understanding as he is. And I also try to take into account what a difficult process it is to become a writer and to have the courage to share your work with people, often strangers, and have them give feedback on it. I, as a student, as you can tell from my essay, Dragon Slayers, could not handle that very well. And if you think about the absurdity of what I did, I think about it now, I still cringe about it. But here I am, this 20-something-year-old person who's never written anything, never published anything. I didn't even know who McPherson was, and he's famous. And I demanded a meeting and went to his office and I scolded him. And rather than him pitching me out on my rear end, he decided to take me under his wing and to teach me and to spend 4 years of his time guiding me through my development as a young writer. And I wish that he lived to see this book and to see my dedication to him. But I think that he would appreciate it. And his daughter certainly appreciated it. She contacted me when the book came out. She was very grateful, so that's nice.
Beautiful, thank you.
I think, Martha, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
After Catherine's comments, I feel a little bit shallow, but I liked very much about both essays that they started in what I would call a misleading way, that they set us up to expect a certain something, such as your authenticity because you knew what you were writing about, or to suspect that you were truly casing Whole Foods and getting ready to snatch purses. So that turning us on our heads 2 times, but also the little details. I loved the stuffed mushroom, the people by the apricots. I think this kind of detail is so effective. And I've been a copy editor for more than 40 years. And I know very well how fragile writers' egos can be. It is truly, truly painful to have one's writing criticized. So although you, in retrospect, may view yourself as, or others may view you as having been arrogant when you went to that office meeting, it's so familiar to me. I've had friends, not I who didn't criticize them, but friends who've been criticized by editors I worked with who had the exact same reaction. It's like having your chest torn open and somebody sticking a hand in your innards and twisting it. It's so painful. So I think it's wonderful to hear the story of your having come out of that encounter in such a magnificent way. And one more question.
Sure, yeah.
Is that really a library ladder behind you?
It is.
Oh,
isn't it awesome? Is it completely awesome?
Totally awesome. I can't believe it.
It is. I should roll it.
You should get up there and pick something down.
Sure.
It's magnificent.
And I bought that pre-pandemic. So I didn't stage it for this. We did a renovation and we fixed my office, and then the pandemic hit, and I thought I'm going to have the best office on Zoom.
Great.
And I just
That's great.
I thank you for appreciating the details. I think a lot of that inclusion of that kind of writing was a result of me being a fiction writer first. And when I went to the writer's workshop, it was to study fiction. And so I wrote short stories and tried to write a novel. And I learned to make use of the techniques that fiction writers use. And when I switched over to nonfiction, I brought those with me. And so what I often do for my students in my nonfiction classes is to have them read short stories and have them understand that even though you're writing essays and even though it's nonfiction, you have every right to take advantage of the tools of the fiction writer. So use dialogue, use characterization, use tone, use all of that. You have your stories, your essays, have a three-dimensional quality.
Nancy, did you want to ask something?
Yes, I wanted to just say, on a personal note, I knew James Allen McPherson back before he became. Am I not? Am I on? I'm not muted. Okay.
Good.
Before he became known, he was a law student at Harvard, and then he worked at the Bay State Banner, and I was working at the Bay State Banner for about a year as a sort of person trying to, I was a college student, and I was trying to help with gaining advertising for the paper. And he was a reporter. He was the most gentle and considerate and thoughtful, and I mean, just a remarkable person. And I felt such a privilege to know him. And we sort of lost touch, but my husband and I were in Charlottesville back in the mid to late 70s, and he was teaching there, I think, at that point at the UVA, and I saw him there again, but I lost touch after that. But by then, he was obviously a well-known writer. I mean, he was a wonderful man. So.
You will not meet anyone who has ever known James McPherson who will say something other than what you just said about him. And that's the greatest tribute you can get. Everybody loved that man. And I was lucky. I was lucky to meet him when I met him. And I was lucky that his humanity and his heart turned out to be as big as they were, or who knows what would have happened with my writing career. I think if he had not helped me rethink my approach to this craft, I think I would be doing something very different right now than being a writer. Or I would be a very bad writer, maybe.
Does anybody have any other questions? I have a handful, which I'm happy.
Yeah, go ahead, Lauren, and I had.
Okay. So I'm sort of glad that you spoke about your start in fiction, because I wasn't aware of that. But I guess one of the questions that I had was, I know you've written longer pieces, so you have 2 memoirs, right? And a lot of the essays, but you also have a lot of things that have been anthologized, and you've written a lot of essays. Is there anything in particular that draws you to the essay form? Because I think some people find it very challenging, and some people find it liberating to have things be in a shorter nonfiction format. Is there anything that you say, oh, I love this part of that about that type of writing?
Well, to go back to my fiction background, so I did get my MFA from Iowa in fiction, and I worked diligently to make it as a fiction writer without success. I would write stories, I would send them out, and they would come back, and I couldn't seem to break through. And then one day my wife said to me, why don't you try nonfiction? Because all of your stories are true anyway. All you've done is change the names. So just write. And I said, are you kidding me? Because everybody thinks, I mean, there's a hierarchy. There's fiction writers, and then there's nonfiction writers, and then the lowly poets. And that's the way, that's what people, and I wanted to be, a fiction writer. But my wife kept telling me, you have to do this, you have to do it. And so to get her off my back, I said, all right, I'll write an essay. And I wrote Dragon Slayers. It was the first essay I'd ever written in my life. And I sent it off to the Iowa Review and they accepted it. And 6 months later, it was anthologized in Best American Essays. And my wife, as you can imagine, said, I told you. And so I thought I would try another. So I wrote another one and I sent it off when it got published, and another and another. And it occurred to me that the reason why I took to this form so well and I was so unsuccessful at fiction writing is because I have an imagination that requires some policing. When I wrote my fiction, I did not know how to contain the events that were happening. I tried to enliven them in a way that made my stories implausible, completely unbelievable. Instead of having, for instance, a mailman deliver a package and leave, I would have the mailman come and I would say, well, what if when he opens the mailbox, a lizard jumps out and bites off his nose? And then my story's off the rails. But with nonfiction, I realized I can't do that. There are no lizards in mailboxes. I have to play it straight. And so I needed the guardrails of fact, of life, of true events to kind of keep my creativity contained. And so within these guardrails, I could be as creative and as wild and as imaginative as I could possibly be. I just couldn't go outside the rails. And that suits me perfectly. I love the essay. I think it can do anything you want it to do, anything fiction writers can do, and you don't have to make it so unbelievably interesting that it stops being believable.
Thank you. That's great. It's such a, I feel like it's tough format. So, or for some, for forms, but I think it is also liberating. So it's nice to hear a little validation there.
Can I just throw in something?
Yeah.
I laughed when you in your first reading, and I chuckled at some other things. And now I'm going to read you. Now, you have a new fan. I'm going to buy your books. I love them.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you.
Does anybody have any other?
Yeah, I have a couple. I always have a million questions, Lauren, you know me.
Go for it.
So two things. One, you almost answered a lot of it when you spoke to Lauren, but I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about the craft of writing. Were you always driven to being a writer, like you were a kid that scribbled, and also how you approach your writing, how you get your ideas for that? I'm just curious, kind of from a personal level, how you do it. And the second thing is, who do you read?
Okay. No, I did not always want to be a writer. In my first memoir, I write about the very difficult childhood I had and the terrible decisions I made that resulted in me dropping out of high school when I was 16 years old. And I got involved. I was living on the south side of Chicago, which you probably hear in news often. It's a rough place. And I got swept up into some pretty bad things. I got involved in drugs and alcohol and petty crimes and all of that stuff. So I dropped out of school when I was 16. And it took me until I was 24 to realize that the life I was leading was going to be a dead-end life, literally, because friends of mine were done. And what I did one day after not knowing what to do with my life, I went to a community college and signed up for classes. And I wanted to be an architect, so I took an architectural class and I failed it. And I took a political science class and I failed that. I took a sociology course and I failed that. And not because I couldn't handle the material, I just I lost interest halfway and I stopped going. And then I took a creative writing class. And my professor, after I wrote my first short story, said, "You have talent and you should be at the Iowa Writers Workshop." I had never heard of the Iowa Writers Workshop. I had barely heard of Iowa. But he said, you have something. And so he worked with me much in the way that McPherson worked with me. And my first book is, in fact, a tribute to all of the people who have helped me move from one stage of my life to the next. But Professor Homewood was the first. And he worked with me at this community college for 2 years. And when it was time to transfer to a 4-year school, he said, let's visit the University of Iowa. And he rented a car because he couldn't afford one. And he drove me out to Iowa City to see the campus. He took me to the offices of the Writers' Workshop and he marched me into the room and said, everyone, this is Jerry Walker. Write his name down. One day he'll be famous. And they all looked at us like we were insane. And then we left. But before we drove back to Chicago,
Wow.
I stopped at the financial aid office and I got all of the brochures and everything. And as we were driving home, Professor Homewood realized that I'd fallen silent. And he said, what's wrong? And I said, I can't go here. Do you see this out-of-state tuition? I can't possibly afford this. And he said, you don't worry about the tuition. I will pay your tuition.
Wow.
My community college professor, who cannot afford a car, said he would pay for my 2 years at Iowa. And he did.
Wow.
And when I finished my BA and I applied to the Writers' Workshop, and by some miracle, I got accepted, I did not call my parents. I didn't call my girlfriend. I didn't call my friends. I called Professor Homewood to tell him that all of his faith in me had paid off.
Wow.
And I'll tell one more quick story about Professor Homewood because he's so central to my life. When I wrote my first book, Street Shadows, I called him and I said, Professor Homewood, I've just written my first book. I'm going to send you a copy and I'm looking forward to seeing you at my reading in Chicago because I was living here in Massachusetts at the time. I'm looking forward to seeing you at my reading. And he said, well, thank you for sending the book, but I have some bad news for you. I have macular degeneration and I'm not going to be able to read it. I can barely see anything now. And I was heartbroken by it, but I sent the book anyway. And I went to Chicago sometime later to have my first reading of my book. And I waited in the lobby of the auditorium for Professor Homewood, and I saw him come out of the elevator, and he was walking with his hand on someone's shoulder who I assumed was a friend of his, but it turned out to be a complete stranger who was simply assisting Professor Homewood because he couldn't see. And Professor Homewood, I said, Professor Homewood, it's me, it's Jerry, it's me. And he thanked the man for bringing him up. He took his hand off the man's shoulder and he put them on mine. And he said, Jerry, my dear boy, I've done it. I managed to read your book, and how fitting it is that yours is the last I'll ever read.
Wow.
And I took him into the auditorium, he introduced him to the crowd, and I gave my first reading in dedication to him.
Wow.
That's
Isn't that
amazing.
great?
Very moving.
Beautiful story. Oh my
Very
God.
moving.
Thank you for sharing that. I also like how you bring your dialogue even into your stories here.
It's a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing for my classes. It's a curse at home because my wife thinks I talk too much.
Well, I could listen to you all night. So, and I'm just curious what you read, or if you're a reader, or you, and what you're drawn to.
I am drawn to. I like essays, and certainly I like satire is my thing. I love Twain. When I was in the Writers' Workshop, I mainly focused on short story writers like Lori Moore. Dennis Johnson was a favorite of mine. See who else was pretty big back then? Stuart Diebeck. Those were the people who I loved at that time. But now, my favorite essayist, who's hysterical, and if you haven't read her, go out and buy her book. Her name is Samantha Irby, and she has an essay collection called "Wow, No Thank You," and it's a riot. She's really, really great.
Yeah, I think there's one before that that maybe came out 2 years ago, which really she's amazing for sure.
Fantastic.
It's hard, I think, sometimes to get humor across on the page. You have to have just the right knack for it. I would argue she has it, and you have it too. So it's a definitely.
How do you spell the last name? Irby.
It's I-R-B-Y. Samantha Irby.
Thank you.
I'm currently reading my second book by James McBride.
Okay, yep.
And I really liked his first book, which was basically a memoir. But the second one is, I don't know if you've read it, Deacon King Kong.
Deacon King Kong. No, I haven't read it yet. It's on my shelf, but I did read the first memoir. Yep.
I have conflicted feelings about it. I mean, at times I find it very funny,
Mhm.
and it reminds me of a kind of a Black humor literature that I read when I was young, and I can't remember the authors that I used to love when I was, in my teens, I would say, or 20s. But he reminds me of certain old school of a Black writer, which you don't encounter much anymore. Anyway.
Well, he's one of the best.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to digging into that as soon as my semester ends, when I can actually read for pleasure again.
Okay.
But he's definitely one of my favorite writers.
Good. I'm glad we agreed. Thank you.
Does anybody, I'm going to hop in with another question that I've been well, there's actually two, but I'll start with the first one that I wrote down. So as I mentioned, you've written Street Shadows and The World in Flames and How to Make a Slave, as you mentioned, that your wife sort of said, a lot of it is true also. How do you, so in a lot of ways, all three are very reflective on your life. I mean, obviously memoirs are, of course, but also too with How to Make a Slave. Do you see them as, I mean, I know that they sort of focus on different points in your life, but How to Make a Slave sort of touches on a lot of your childhood and young adulthood. How do you see them in context with one another, or is that sort of irrelevant?
Well, I think it's relevant because when your primary subject is yourself, which I don't know what that says about me, that every time I want to write a book, I want to write about myself. But the works do speak to one another in pretty key ways. Street Shadows, though it spans about 40 years of my life, it primarily focuses on my misspent youth on the south side of Chicago and how those experiences shaped me as an adult. My second memoir is centered in a 10-year period from age about 6 to 16, when I was in a doomsday cult that my parents were in, that they believed in, and how that shaped my life. How it, in many ways, I don't want to say ruined, because I have this awesome bookcase behind me, so I'm doing okay. But it definitely had a negative impact on my life. But in the third book is mainly from my later parenting years. So they cover different parts, even though you'll recognize the same sorts of interest of mine and the same themes and the same preoccupations.
What is the name of your second book?
It's called The World in Flames, a Black Boyhood in a White Supremacist Doomsday Cult. If you can believe that.
Yes.
I want to know if you came up with that title yourself or if your editor did.
My editor did. My editor did. I wanted to call it Shattered Water, and she thought that was ridiculous. And she said, it will never sell. It will never sell. We have to call it. She picked the title, but she turned out to be wrong too.
Really? How so?
It sold pretty well. It did okay.
I think it's a grabber of a title.
It certainly catches your attention.
And just because I can't help be a librarian, I just tossed in the link for The World in Flames if anybody wants to put a hold on it from the library copy. But of course, we're also supporting Belmont Books throughout this as a co-sponsor, so I'm sure that they'd be able to order a copy as well. So dual plugs, so you get some extra sales too, obviously. I had one other question, which I don't, it seemed relevant mostly because you chose to read Dragon Slayers. So I don't know if you had seen there was a 60 Minutes interview with Colson Whitehead a couple weeks ago. And I think the biggest tagline for it that got so much press was he spoke to what he calls the existential terror of being descendants from slaves while writing Underground Railroad. And his sort of experience for him while writing something that really spoke to that existential terror. And in Dragon Slayers, you write about, you don't write about white cruelty, you write about, and you teach your students about Black courage, because slaves and their immediate descendants were by and large heroic, otherwise we wouldn't be here, right? What are your thoughts? I don't think that maybe, obviously I don't know Colson Whitehead, but I figure part of this is a terror, and there's something that fuels that. So I guess, is that something that you identify with, or is that something that maybe speaks to you, or do you feel kind of the opposite? What are your thoughts on that sense of an existential terror?
Oh, I share it. And I saw the interview, and as soon as he said that, I thought that's exactly right. I can't imagine writing the Underground Railroad or any book that requires me to transport myself back to that time and place for an extended period. I think it might kill me. I don't know if I could do it. Even just writing about my own experiences going through dark times in the South Side of Chicago was a very difficult thing to relive. And when I wrote my second book, the memoir about being in a doomsday cult, which was as horrible as it sounds, although the book is funny, if you can believe it, that was difficult to relive those experiences. In fact, a friend of mine wondered why I wrote that as my second book. He couldn't believe that I had this experience and this material that I'd been holding back. And I had a reason for that. I didn't want to go back to that place. I didn't want to spend that time with that material. But as a nonfiction writer, you almost don't have a choice. You've got to use what you've been given. And so I had to go back to that dark time, but it takes something out of you. And one of the essays in How to Make a Slave is the title essay, How to Make a Slave. And in it, I talk about how as a young kid, first learning about the horrors of slavery, it's kind of a depressing thing as if you're an African American. And you find out that your ancestors had been enslaved for 400 years. And that's kind of a bummer. And then you're saddled with that kind of dark cloud as your past. And I wondered, as I say in the essay, as a young kid, I wish Black history had some funny parts, like some mental relief where we could look back and then not all be horror and terror. And so when I wrote this essay collection, I was determined to try to find the funny parts about the Black experience, so that it's not all tears and grief, that there is joy and laughter in the Black experience. And I wanted to focus on that more than anything else in this, so that people can get a well-rounded view of what it is to be an African American. It's not all one thing or another, and it's certainly not joyless, as some accounts would have you believe.
Very good.
I had one last question. I know we're a little over, but I would love to see if anybody else has anything that they wanted to chime in at all before I hog the mic again.
I was just gonna say, is that when you discovered that you were funny and having to, because you're a very humorous writer, and discovering that about oneself, it's a lift, isn't it?
It is. I think I have always known that I like a good laugh and a good joke. And I had to simply find my humorous voice, and that took some time. And I found it, though, and I'm not going back. You're not going to read any sad tearjerker stuff for me anymore. I have plenty of that in the Street Shadows, even though there's some humor in that as well. But for me, it's going to be jokes and laughs from here on out.
Thank you.
Well, I guess my final question, if you don't mind, is you wrote a lot about, and what I think was really kind of fun is that there's funny parts, and you also see how your humor and your relationship with your sons evolves over the course of various essays. So I guess my question is, have they, and I assume they're older now. So, and I know you mentioned earlier that they're older. Have they read your works, and are they aware of some of these like internal struggles you had like when they were younger, and whether or not to talk about issues of race and the sort of, do they know that that was a thing that you experienced at the time?
I cannot get my sons to read a single word of anything I've written. And I don't know what that's about. My wife tells me they're just kids. Who wants to read about their parent? You're a nerd as far as they're concerned. They have no interest whatsoever in your life. But she assures me that one day that will change. One day they'll say, I want to read one of Dad's books. But for now, they don't want to read them. Even though I told them they're in this book. They're major players in this, and they have no interest whatsoever in it. None.
How old are they?
They are 20 and 18.
Okay, that was like the one burning
Give them
question.
time. Give them time.
Yeah,
Till
okay.
they have children.
So
When
I
they,
have one-
when they have kids, maybe they'll
oh,
want to.
even before
It's
that.
your perspective. It makes you wonder about, your own parents and your grandparents and their lives and what they experienced. You get, yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah, no, that they will. I have a question. Would you ever be interested in writing, or have you ever written a screenplay? I think you'd be brilliant at it.
I know nothing about screenplays, except that they potentially pay very well. So the answer is yes. I would be very happy to write a screenplay if you know of where I can get the work.
I'll ask around.
All right. Well, thank you, Gerald, so much. Does anybody have any final words and final questions before we wrap up here?
I just wanted to comment that I'm also have Iowa roots, and I don't know when you were at the workshop. I went to Grinnell College, and so Iowa City was a familiar kind of place to go when you got tired of Grinnell. And
I assume would be pretty quickly.
yeah, well, you get used to it, I guess.
Not much going on in Grinnell.
No. Well, actually, they had a wonderful director of performing arts who would get fantastic musicians and to come to perform there. I don't know if they still do, but I never. And in those days, it wasn't as easy to find out what was going on in the big city without internet and all that stuff. So you kind of had to go and see what was going on.
Yep. Well, I was there pre-internet, and it was I haven't been back recently. My wife and I, after we lived there for 10 years, and we loved it. And we only left because we needed jobs, and we simply couldn't find any in Iowa City. But if we could go back, we loved it. We loved it.
Yeah, Catherine, what part of Iowa are you from?
I was from the fabulous city of Coralville, which was my era was 3,000 people. One of those towns where if you got into trouble, which we did, your mother heard about it, But it was also a town where everybody knew each other. So even though I was in sort of the working class town, you could run into Van Allen, the astrophysicist at the A&P, or my father knew Professor Ingalls, who was then the head of the writers' workshop. In fact, he told a funny story that he went to his wedding, and it was an era of the 60s, and he said everybody was barefoot and had beads and flowers. I'm a doctor, I'm the suit, and there was a lawyer in the suit, but they were only two people that were in suits. But you knew people in town. It was that small. So
Where do you live now?
I live in Hingham.
Hingham there. Far cry.
Yep, we love it. When I worked at Bridgewater State, which is in Bridgewater, I worked there for 10 years, and then I got a job at Emerson, and we needed to find a place in between the two because my wife still works at Bridgewater State. And so Hingham was the middle ground with great schools for our sons. And so that's where we landed.
Thank you.
Well,
This is fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Really nice.
Thank you all.
But
Great.
not in person.
Yeah.
I did pop a feedback form in the chat. If anybody gets a chance, we would love to hear your thoughts about any of the One Book, One Belmont programming, but obviously all things go, and especially about this evening. I can say personally that it was an absolute delight to have you speak to your collection of essays, which you do have in the library collection, and you could also buy from Belmont Books if anybody was so inclined. So thank you all so much. for joining.
Invite him back, Lauren.
Sure will,
Okay, thank you.
if he's willing.
I am willing. I had a great time. Thank you, Lauren, for inviting me, and thank you all for hanging out with me tonight and for the great questions. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you. If you want to send me an email, if you read the book and you want to carry on our conversation, I'm happy to do it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
All
you.
right. Have a good night, everyone.